Well, good day, folks. I hope everybody's having a good Sunday today. Is today Sunday? Yeah, today's Sunday. Hope everybody's having a good day today. I just thought I would go on here and, discuss some things, topics I normally cover, but also some other issues. I wanted to say that in my East and West uh, origins and differences live I had made, there were a few things I forgot to add that I casually mentioned last night in the show I did over with Jennifer and Ruger. Um, I had said that uh, the West had tried to infiltrate Eastern nations by conducting a series of different assassinations, high profile ones, of certain leaders, and beyond what they've already done in Eastern Europe here by inciting the armed forces of Ukraine to go into the Donbass and basically invade it in full force, and they armed them and trained them to do that prior even to the Russians conducting what they call their special military operation, otherwise known as a limited incursion. Um, there'd been a lot of meddling going on in Eastern Europe. And why would that be the case? Well, that would be the case. Again, I should have added this. That would be the case because they don't control Russia or Belarus. So we remember within the span of a year, just under a year ago, they had tried to take out who? They tried to take out Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus. If you all recall, also, in the the Mid East, they had tried to do the 7 countries in 5 years scheme, whereby they were going to go in and knock off the regimes of basically 7 Middle Eastern countries, one being also in North Africa. Well, actually, two if you count Egypt. They did a color revolution in Egypt. They went in there with they incited a civil conflict and a color revolution in Libya, which almost failed because Gaddafi had cracked down on it. Why? Because Gaddafi was going to introduce a gold dinar. He even wanted to do a trans-African high-speed railroad, if y'all didn't know that. He was trying to bring prosperity to Africa, and these Western nations just couldn't have that. They just couldn't have it. So that is the true reason why they got rid of Gaddafi. Now, they also tried to do a color revolution in Syria, but Syria is firmly in the eastern camp. They are, Assad's regime is closely aligned with Russia, China, Iran. Uh, they weren't having it. They were not having it. Now, in all fairness, in the Syrian civil conflict, Assad's regime was on the ropes. It was on the ropes. Now, these different factions, and sects that arose within Syria. Now, some were moderate and secular, and others were extreme religious kooks and crazies. They had arisen in Syria. You know, some were given Western arms and support, some were not. Plenty were not. But regardless, they had Assad on the ropes. But that ship never sailed because Assad's regime had strong support from Russia, Iran, and also proxies. Proxies. And what I mean by proxies are groups that, were independent groups, but were aligned with the Assad regime. And these groups were mostly out of Lebanon. And some of these groups had fought Israel for a very long time. But they participated in the Syrian internal conflict on the Assad regime side. Now, you also had an attempt at a color revolution in Iran. You had an attempt at a color revolution. You sure did. If you remember correctly, there were a lot of stories coming out of Iran many years ago that this was attempted there, but it failed. It failed. And in the same way that our intelligence agencies tried to craft these different color revolutions. Now, Iraq was not a color revolution situation, nor was Afghan. Now, we went in there directly into those two nations to affect the changes that we desired to see. Now, I was in the Iraq War, occupying Iraq as an occupying power, and, I was there directly. But, we did that directly to affect the changes that we desired to see there. Now, we really lost all the way around as far as, our ability to influence that part of the world. And now we even see that we have lost our grip over Saudi. Now, Saudi is making deals with China to do a petro-yuan renminbi, even defense deals. There's Chinese troops right now in Saudi. There's also Russians, too. They made separate deals with Russia. So what does that mean? And it means that the Eurasian bloc is rising. Now, like we've tried to conduct assassinations and color revolutions, and also that recent attempt at something like an assassination, I don't even know what to call it, on Putin, it had completely failed. He knew what was going on. His intelligence agencies basically caught those responsible. The FSB has caught those responsible for it. And he avoided that situation. But they tried it on Lukashenko too, but the FSB of Russia foiled that attempt as well. But likewise, you see China doing very similar things that the West has done to these Eastern nations. You see China conducting very similar things. Now, what I mean by that, and also Russia, really, if you want to get into it, Russia and China, with China purchasing their CCP regime properties throughout Western nations, predominantly here in the United States, but also in Canada and even to some extent in Europe, what they did theirs for was not so much for a color revolution as it was to directly start placing their armed forces as Trojan shock armies. Now, with the purchasing of the ports, and I love my Long Beach example, those of you who have been with me for a while, because that is our biggest West Coast port. The CCP, through a shell company, through a proxy, it was directly owned by the CCP, so let's get that straight. It just had a special name because remember, the CCP in China is the ultimate authority. China's not a true market economy. They are a command economy with market qualities, meaning that the CCP creates shell companies that it controls. And I've said that about Alibaba. You don't get a position in these companies unless you kiss the ring of Xi Jinping. So there's a little rhyme there for you. Now, you don't get those positions unless you are a member of the CCP regime and you have kissed their ring. So they have purchased these ports, and those ports served as their primary logistical centers by which they would import these units and their vehicles, sort of like how we would basically use Al Shawaiba port over there in Kuwait to bring our vehicles in, load them up on trucks, send them where they had to go. Well, likewise, but more stealthy under our noses, they were doing the same things with their CCP ports. They were importing these military forces and vehicles. Now, also keep in mind, their forces also cross at will across the open borders to the south, but also to the north. They come in through planes and into the airports as students, in quotes, and other job classes, I guess you could say, or identities that are crafted for them. Now, keep in mind, you cannot even get an exit visa to leave China to go somewhere like here as a student unless you have either been part of their paramilitary or their PLA or something, in some sort of armed service for the Chi-Com regime. So these students, I would say, fairly large cross section of them is current PLA or PAP or maybe National Militia, which is another paramilitary branch, or National Construction Corps, or Navy, whatever it is. I would say a large cross section of them is active right now. And even the ones that aren't, they've been in the service of the CCP regime, but they've been allowed in here, and they've been allowed to go and either stay at these CCP properties if they're active, and which would serve to be their muster and assembly points in any future invasion, or we know that they could be working in other capacities. They could even be working in support roles for any future invasion. It's entirely possible. So we know they're here. We know they've imported their military vehicles. Well, Chad, how would they get them to their CCP properties deeper inland? Well, here's how they would do it. They would load them up on trucks that are driven by either members of the CCP forces with CDLs, like independent truckers, or by trucking companies that are friendly with the CCP. And it's not just the Chinese forces, it's all of their allies too. Because the CCP is going to let their allies use their properties, of course. China's the biggest landowner in this country. They own more land than Gates or any of the rest of them. China is the biggest landowner in this country. They have more properties than anybody. And those are their bases. And they do strategically place these properties. If you've watched my work, my past work, then you see how all of that works. You see how they materialize. You see where they come from. You see that they come from these CCP properties, and that's where these units just pop up on the map. They pop up on the CCP properties, and these properties are always very close to their objectives. Now, all these different battalions, which are the subunits that comprise either regiments or brigades or divisions, which also comprise these greater group armies, these group armies, or whatever else it is. If it's a paramilitary entity, if we're talking people armed police, they have corps size units that fall either under the first or second mobile contingents, and they also have a force, a third one that is basically for at home, and at home only. It's not able to deploy anywhere else. But these three contingents, you would have corps size units or divisions that would fall beneath them. Now, that's just one paramilitary branch. They have other branches of paramilitary that are even bigger, like their national militia and marine militia, which are basically like a paramilitary equivalent of our Army National Guard for their national militia, and then their Marine militia would be like a combo of the Coast Guard mixed with like the Marine Corps Reserves. I'm trying to think of something to equate that to. So then you have your National Construction Corps as well, which is, it's a lot bigger than a corps, but it's basically armed and trained construction people, like a combat engineering entity is the best thing I can call it, but they're paramilitary. Then they have their PLA Strategic Reserve, which is not the PLA Reserve, but it's their Strategic Reserve, which is strictly for home defense, and they would fall under PLA command in a time of war. So you have all these paramilitary forces, and then you have their regular military and their reserves that comprise this just gargantuan, behemoth, ginormous military and paramilitary, just their whole overall armed forces. So they have been infiltrating us, sort of like in a response almost to what our intelligence agencies conduct overseas with their their covert operations. Only this is a covert operation that is on a drastically larger scale. Now, you had these people like Newland, Victoria Newland, and others state what they wanted to do to Russia. They want to break it up, or at very bare minimum, they want it to be as weak as they were in the 90s after the collapse of the USSR, when these corrupt oligarchs would sell out assets that used to be state assets. It used to be like state factories and industries and state assets of all different types. They would sell them out to these Western elites. So they were selling their former country out upon its collapse. They want Russia weak. They want it under their control. They've been kicked out of Russia, as I've shown you in my East versus West differences video. They've been kicked out of Russia a few different times, where they were, dethroned from their perch to where they could have basically brought Russia into the fold as a subordinate nation to the Western elites. Now, when you see Putin meeting with, the Western Economic Forum, and then right away he disavows them, they disavow him, this war begins where East and West are fighting in Ukraine, and the West is using Ukraine as a proxy, and they've stated that their goal is to use that to weaken Russia, which it will never do. Russia has enormous assets to bring to bear, and they haven't even really used but 5% of their military, if that. It's like I've said in the past, it's only 1/15th to 1/30th, which is the next fraction, up, as far as like the size difference. Somewhere between 1/15th and 1/30th at the smallest end is the forces that they brought to bear in that limited incursion, what they call a special military operation. There's a lot of movements going on, and there's a lot of bullshit that's going on in that conflict. Like, you have the Ukrainians, the PSYOP products around that war, like the so-called alleged ghost of Kiev or whatever it was called, and all this other bullshit. And these alleged victories, which weren't victories at all, but was a direct result of Russia pulling out of territory because they were conducting feint attacks or a war of maneuver with the very small, limited forces that they've committed to this entire thing within the borders of that nation itself. Now, you really think about it, 65,000 troops, which is about the 70 battalions that they've committed there, is not that big. It's really not that big. Now, when Ukraine had started the conflict, they were 10 times larger, 10 times, than what Russia had actually, committed in the field. Now, the Russians weren't completely alone. Of course, they had, the 30,000 or so proxies of the LPR and DPR forces that they had armed and equipped and trained with Russian equipment. Now, it was them and their proxies. So you really had closer to about 100,000 against 600 and something thousand when all of it's considered, all things are considered. But the Russians is who I'm talking about, not their proxies, just them. They only committed this tiny, puny force into Ukraine, and they've ground the Ukrainians down gradually. Now, of course, you have this big, hooping and hollering about Izium and everything, but the Russians had pulled out of Izium, and there's a channel that even predicted they would do that. It's called the Duran channel. I listened to them, and they were talking about it today, and they were even talking about a past show where they predicted it, and I believe I've seen that. And, the Russians are conducting maneuvering. They conduct maneuvering where they conduct these combat maneuvers. They allow the Ukrainians in, and then they destroy them with missiles and artillery, much like they did the first time that they moved out of the Kharkov area. Ukrainians went in, they claimed a victory, while the Russians annihilated them and moved back in. Well, recently they did that again. I've mentioned this before. Now, Izium, they left Izium. Ukrainians moved in, claimed victory, and now they're making a big deal out of it, because they moved into essentially what amounts to empty territory. And they're already committing atrocities on the locals there, which is horrible, but, they're known to do that. So I'm not taking sides in that whole thing, but all I would simply say about it is that it's depleting us, our country, of resources that are vital to our own national defense. Russia and China are playing a game of rope-a-dope, it's a distraction by which we are dumping in military resources and money that we can neither afford to commit or replace. We cannot replace, not easily anyway, what was just given and dumped into that black hole. And that's not the only black hole. Of course, Afghan was a black hole too, where we had left all this weaponry behind, all of these billions of dollars of weaponry. We literally spent trillions on the Iraq and Afghan wars, and we lost a lot of good people. Lost a lot of good people in those conflicts. I've seen people perish in my unit as well. Just in my battery, which is, my company-sized unit I was in, my artillery battery, we lost 2 people just in our battery, but our greater unit, our regiment, lost even more. But our battery contributed to 2 people, but when you take the whole regiment into account, there were dozens of deaths, fatalities. It was terrible. And that was just our deployment. It seemed like every week there was a memorial service on our forward operating base for somebody that had perished in the line of duty, perished in combat. We were losing somebody seemingly there for a minute about every week in the summer and fall of 2008. I was there from 07 to 09. And 08 was the first time I was injured in the summer. I was blown up in my MRAP, which I've already shown the picture of on fire because it caught on fire. Some sort of accelerant, a white phosphorus mortar, had lit what remained after the engine block was completely ripped all the way off in the blast, by anti-tank mines stacked one upon another on another. It was a triple stacked anti-tank mine and an accelerant, a white phosphorus mortar of some kind. And it blew that whole thing off and lit the cab on fire. I was knocked unconscious for a few minutes. And then when I came to, the whole thing was on fire. I had to get out, or else I would have been trapped and burned alive with all the cooking ammunition that began to cook off. It was like popcorn inside of that vehicle. Anyway, I look, I don't know I forgot where I was going with that. I got in the zone, but what I was saying was about the issue with Ukraine, okay? We're dumping all sorts of stuff into that conflict. There's, combatants from Western nations that are being annihilated in that conflict. They thought it would be like Call of Duty or like some kind of video game. But it's real war. People die. Or they get injured. They die or they get injured. And they're finding that out the hard way. And because a lot of them are mercenaries, if they're captured, they're going to go to Russian prisons, supermax prisons. They're going to be tried in court under the Russian terrorism clause, because that's what they're going to be looked at as, because they're paid as mercenaries. They're not fighting under a flag, per se. They were paid foreign mercs. So they're going to be tried under that clause, and they're going to be put in Russian supermax penitentiaries like Black Dolphin and others. And it's not a nice place to spend, the rest of your natural life. It's a very dangerous situation for people to play around with. It's not Iraq, it's not Afghan, it's not even Syria. Russia is the second most powerful nation on earth. And China's the world hegemon. China's the world superpower. And they're both allies. All that this conference was that occurred in Zanarkand, which is in Central Asia, all that was signaling things that already are and have been in effect. If people aren't aware, the Iranians and Russians have been already allies. They call it, the new word for it is strategic partnership, in quotes. That's the new word for it. They've already had an alliance. They've already had a strategic partnership. I guess people forgot back in 2020 where the Chinese and Russians based their troops in Iran. I guess everybody forgot about that. That's already been in effect now for a few years. The Chinese sent 50,000 of their troops there. 50,000, that's like the equivalent of an entire group army. Well, there's bigger group armies than that even, of about 80,000, and there's maybe a few that are 100,000, but the standard group army is between 45 and 50,000. So that's like a whole group army that China has garrisoned in Iran. Chinese state oil companies get actually a lot of China's oil production from Iranian oil fields. They have made in their deals that they get a lot of Iranian oil in exchange for modernizing the Iranian military forces, as well as basing their troops there to protect Iran in the event of war. That's real. That happened 2 years ago. It's been finalized. Now, the Russians, too. They've based some of their Air Force assets in Iran as well. They've also built Iran nuclear power plants. Now, that was many years ago. So, these nations have already been in an alliance for quite some time now. It's nothing new. All that really occurred at that summit was they were just confirming what we already know to be the case, the fact. And they've drawn in ancillary nations that were, sitting on the periphery into their alliance, their Eurasian bloc. They've already cut the United States out of the fold. Not completely, yet, but it's going that way. And I don't think the majority of Americans understands that their reality is about to change drastically very soon. The collapse is coming, and so is the internal conflict that'll be a direct result of that. The Syrian-style internal conflict that I've shown everybody to be the case, because all the stuff from my research, my diligent research that was put into that, is already manifesting now. A lot of it is already under the surface, and it's beginning to bubble up to the surface. So the prerequisites at the beginning of my, now if you've watched the whole thing, and you really need to watch the whole thing to understand it, The very first video is a storytelling of how it all began and how all the factions came to be who they were. The second video is half of it is a story. It's the continuation of the first origins part. It's the story about the coups, and then after that comes the first major battles. Now, I tried to make it understandable that this conflict, although it'll be a multi-faction, sectarian group, whatever, Syrian-style conflict, which that's what that means. It means a factional, sectarian conflict. When I say Syrian-style, that's what I'm alluding to. Now, although it'll be like that, by and large, much of it will be low intensity, like I've said in the docu-series. But, like in Syria, there would be, maybe a few dozen major battles occurring where you would have these big armies gather strength in their numbers as well as their logistics in order to be able to prosecute an actual campaign or a battle. You would have certain areas where along the front lines where it would be more like of a high intensity war situation whereby you would have these field armies accumulate enough forces, maybe in like the tens of thousands on each side, and even multi-factional battles where you would have the different front lines of these different factions intersecting in one place at one point, like in the Macon battle, or even in the Vegas Hoover Dam battle, which was a huge battle with four different sides. The Macon one was a three-sided one. The Martinsville one was three-sided. You had these different battles occurring. Some of them were two-sided, some were three, some were four. But either way, these forces accumulated and gathered their logistics and gathered their strength to conduct these large campaigns that were more like high-intensity war. But by and large, much of it was low intensity, where you had these front lines extending for many, 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 many miles. And by low intensity, that means it would consist largely of like small scale ambushes or traps or, maybe an exchange of artillery here and there, trading shells with each other, and, maybe some instances of what would be looked upon as like small scale trench warfare in some areas. It would be like that by and large across the board, minus where these armies and forces would be able to actually gather in sufficient numbers for it to be more of a high intensity thing. By that I mean they would be able to bring vehicles to bear and their artillery to bear in concentrated forms, and they would be able to bring up logistics in order to like punch through an enemy line and push ahead take territory. That would be like that would be the and more of an occasional thing, whereas the rest of it would be like a lot, like a whole ton of low intensity warfare. Now, don't get me wrong. Low intensity warfare is every bit as deadly as high intensity warfare, because you can either have an instance of a large battle or you could have just a whole ton of low intensity situations where people are just gradually being butchered over the course of time. It would be a lot like that. It would be a lot like that. I see it being a combo of the two different instances whereby you would have, of course, your large campaigns and battles, but most of the front lines would be a lot quieter, but it would still be every bit as deadly because you would have people trying to snipe each other or set traps like mines or whatever, or trade shells or do patrols and ambushes, whatever else. Small scale trench warfare. That would be the low intensity aspect, but that would be by and large along the front lines, that would be what it would be. But minus those occasions where you would have these larger battles where more forces could be concentrated with more logistics and vehicles to where they would be able to do breakthroughs or attempt to. So I said all that to say this, I put a lot of detail in that, but there's a lot of underlying factors, and I've called many of them correctly. And when they manifest, it'll manifest into such a situation. Now, what does that have to do with everything else? What it has to do with it is that our foreign enemies, you best believe that they have a hand to play in all of that. You best believe that they would be stoking that. Every bit as we have stoked the regime changes in the form of our covert activities around the world, such as the color revolutions, all the dirty, underhanded things that Western nations have done to other nations around the world, it'll be done to us too. So you can understand and believe that Russia and China and other major powers, such as their allies, you can best believe that they're going to play a role, which I even put in my documentary, when the Chinese and Russians used third countries like Venezuela and Mexico to be the point where they would send in weapons and and money or whatever else they needed to send in order to further destabilize us as a country. You best believe they would have a hand in that. That would be one of many different ways by which they could conduct such a thing, such a destabilization effort. Now, I put that in my documentary. That occurred somewhere near the beginning of it, but it was a few weeks in. They jumped at the opportunity to destabilize this place as much as they could by sending weapons and whatever else. So you have that. Then you have this place being invaded upon it basically being diminished of everything resource-wise. Fuel, food, weapons, all of it would be diminished. Even the people that would have been able to create these partisan elements that would have been able to, at least make it harder for these foreign armies to occupy a land this huge, it would have made it sufficiently more difficult. Like in my stories, if you read my stories, or even listening to the audiobook, I'm going to get into what occurs after the invasion phase, at least a little bit. But the audiobook is mostly about just the invasion aspect of it. But what happened in my timeline where there was no collapse and civil conflict was that you had these partisans. It would be like right now, if they just invaded us right now in the current state we're in, where there's no collapse, no nothing, they just come in and invade. They could kick our ass and annihilate our depleted, puny, woke military with their the combination of their anti-satellite weapons with a debilitating cyber attack that takes down our grid, because our grid is tied to the net. Our telecom, all of that is tied to the net. So anything tied to the net can be hacked. They can take everything down with a debilitating, devastating cyber attack, as well as they're knocking our satellites out of the sky with their S-500s in the case of Russia and the FK-2000s in the case of China. They're anti-satellite weapons that are tried and true. They've been tested. They probably have lasers, too, that can do that, too. Who knows? But I know that they have those S-500s in the case of Russia, FK-2000s in China's case. They're going to down our satellites at the same time as they wipe out our grid, telecom, net, and everything with the cyber warfare. So when that happens, they also have these potent electronic warfare systems that we know they have that are tried and true in the case of China and Russia. They've been used on us in the case of the Donald Cook, 2 times in Russia's case against the Donald Cook, and 1 time in China's case against those F-35s that wandered into the electronic field and almost crashed. They almost crashed. So we know they have that, and we know that they're set up, including with their electronic warfare, in their CCP properties that are within range of critical structures, military infrastructure, such as the silos and everything else. With their electronic warfare, they have electronic warfare aircraft and vehicles too. And vehicles, ground vehicles, aircraft, it's on their ships. They would be using a combo of cyber electronic warfare, and downing our satellites to make us totally deaf, dumb, and blind to where we can't do anything to react. They would hit us with their hypersonics, be they conventional, or be some of them maybe armed with tactical nukes. They're not going to use a whole ton of nukes, you guys. They don't need to. But I'm sure they will use at least a few dozen where they absolutely deem it a necessity. But I think nukes are overly hyped. They're overly hyped because people don't understand what the Chinese and Russians have as far as actual capabilities. And they don't understand that a lot of these psyops that come out of Western media are there as fear and agitation propaganda. It's nothing but hype, fear, and agitation propaganda. It's there to agitate, put in fear, and as hype, because they have to have their narrative. Because the nuke thing is part of their narrative to make people think that Russia is losing in Ukraine when in fact they're not, when in fact they haven't even committed but 70 battalions, 63 to 65,000 troops. Their military, combined even with their 300,000 paramilitary, is 3.5 million. So you do the math. What is 63 or 65,000 troops out of 3.5 million total? I'm talking their active reserves and paramilitary. It's really nothing. But in their narrative, Russia's expended so much of their defense capabilities. No, folks, the reason why they sent in such a small force is because they need forces to defend such a humongous nation against NATO and the West. Why do you think that they have basically done a limited incursion? Because they have to maintain strategic flexibility. Strategic flexibility means that they have to have forces to react to threats in other areas. Folks, you already know that if the West thought Russia was doing so bad, you already know they would jump at the chance to basically attack Russia, whatever that led to. Even if they attempted to invade them, if they felt that Russia was truly doing that bad. In reality, I mean behind closed doors in the Pentagon, wherever in the halls, the quote unquote halls of power, if they truly felt Russia was doing that bad, you already know. Because you know what what they want to do to Russia to bring it into the fold under the Western elites is they want to dismantle Russia. They've said it. Their actions prove it. They want to dismantle Russia. Russia is not going to ever allow that. We know Russia's even in prophecy. For those of you that are into your prophecy, well, Russia is part of end times prophecy, King of the North. And I suppose they could even be used interchangeably with the kings of the East, which is China. China is 100% the kings of the East, but the King of the North is also 100% Russia. So those two nations play a gargantuan role in end times prophecy because the West is not even mentioned after a certain point. The West is not even mentioned. It's destroyed, and that's about the last we hear of it. Because Russia and China have their new world order. So whatever the media says about Russia doing bad, we know offhand already is bullshit. But it's not only that we know it's bullshit because the media lies, we also know it's bullshit for two other reasons. One being, as far as a physical reason, being that Russia has only sent in this puny force. And the other reason is prophecy. So we know certain things have to take place in prophecy, but the physical reality even backs up prophecy, and prophecy backs up the physical, because it's manifesting in the physical. So, all in all, media is continually pumping out lies. They won't give you the truth, even if the truth is inconvenient, because they're all evil, everybody. They're all evil. The East and the West, they're all evil. But whatever truth is inconvenient, for the elites of either side, they're going to leave it out. But in this case, Russia is not doing poorly in Ukraine. They've been saying that now. Do you all even understand that they've been saying that for months, and yet Russia's still there? They haven't been dislodged. They're still there. They're still there. All these months later, Russia has expended 3,600,000 plus artillery shells, 20,000 shells a day. Ukraine couldn't even keep up with that. They spent 6,000 shells a day for 2 months, and they ran out of howitzer artillery shells, either because their depots were captured or destroyed, or they just ran out of the shells, all in all. So they couldn't keep up, but for 2 months, and they could only do 6,000 a day, while Russia did 20,000 a day and is still going, like the Energizer rabbit. They have these just stockpiles of artillery, of ammunition, of everything that are so huge that I don't even have words for it. And that's just Russia. China's even bigger. They're even bigger. While in the case of the NATO exercises, Britain and France in the NATO exercises expend their whole national stockpile, the entire thing, everybody. They expend their entire national stockpile of artillery shells in 8 days. 8 days. That's just a week and a day. In a week and a day, they are out of artillery shells, Britain and France. That it didn't say anything about Germany and Italy, but we already know that Germany and Italy, the other two biggest Western European NATO contributors, we already know how small they are, too, in everything. I've already read all the numbers. I've read all the numbers combining Britain, Italy, France, and Germany into one thing against Russia. All the numbers of them combined against Russia. And it's not even a competition against Russia. Just Russia. We know the Chinese have their troops in Serbia to help Russia take over the West, Western Europe, just like Russia's going to help China to take over North America. They're the closest of allies. That's why I picked the thumbnail that I picked for this, where the Chinese and Russian forces are, embracing after an exercise that they carried out together. They're constantly carrying out training exercises together. They're the closest of allies. Russia provides China just an immense amount of raw materials and resources, and in exchange, China provides Russia with goods. In some cases, even technology. China has really come a long way as far as being a leader in technology from where they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, they were busy conducting industrial espionage on Western nations. They were busy copycatting the West. Now they're the world leader in many areas of technology, robotics and AI, creating miniature artificial stars, all kinds of different weaponry, anti-satellite directed energy, cyber warfare. They've come a long way, everybody. The Chinese have. They've come a long way in everything. Russia has a lot of technology itself. It just doesn't have the numbers of it that China has. China has these things in humongous quantities. But Russia, they have their, robotic military assets. If everybody's seen the information on that, China does. Look, China and South Korea and Japan were 3 of the first countries to introduce the infamous 5. But they used their 5 for a whole plethora of different things. And you know what I mean by 5. There was a consortium of different companies that all shared in the development of that technology. It can be used as a weapon, very easily. Very easily. You know, these nations have developed their own weapons based on that technology too. So I'm saying that Russia and China, while we have fought these counterinsurgencies against less technologically developed people, Russia and China have full-fledged militaries with very potent weaponry, air power, sea power, land power. While we fought counterinsurgencies and never truly won them against people that didn't even have an air force. I was there, folks. I know. We had good weapons, and they didn't want to go toe-to-toe with us. But their asymmetrical tactics eventually got the best of us. They drained us over a long span of time. Sure, they couldn't go toe-to-toe with us. We had heavy weapons and air power. They didn't. And a lot of them died for every single one of us that died. A lot of them. The attrition rate is always terrible when you have untrained irregulars fighting against a well-trained, well-oiled machine of a actual military force or even paramilitary. The well-oiled machine of a well-trained, well-equipped, well-disciplined military is going to win against irregulars every time. But the reason why irregulars, I'm talking about in actual combat, that's always the case, by and large. Very rarely do irregulars get the one-up on the well-trained military. But the reason why irregulars win wars is quantity has a quality all of its own. So does a span of time where you're constantly harrying and draining the foreign military power. I'm talking about in the case where it's an asymmetrical resistance against an occupying power. The irregulars or the partisans, guerrillas, whatever you want to call them, insurgents, whatever, they can outlast a foreign military by just nitpicking at them over a long span of time. Sure, they rarely win in the conventional battling that they conduct against the occupiers, but picking away at a military force gradually over a long span of time, even despite losing humongous quantities of people doing it, is still going to make that impact and still potentially win the conflict. Did you know that in Vietnam, the death toll was in the millions? At the lowest end, they say it was 1 million, but it's a million plus. And at the higher end, people have estimated it to be as high as 5 to 8 million have died in the Vietnam War, fighting us. Millions for our 50,000. Understand what that means, that the attrition rate was so insanely high there that we lost 50, 60,000 troops, okay? We lost 50 to 60,000. They lost millions. Now, in Iraq and Afghan, it was a similar situation. We lost in the low thousands. Of course, we had a lot of injured and wounded, but that was a result. We would have lost more had we not had better vehicles since the Vietnam conflict. If we had not had better materials for our vehicles and our vests and helmets, if we had not have had better protection equipment by the time Iraq and Afghanistan happened, if we'd have been using the same stuff that we used in Vietnam, we would have had the same level of fatalities that there was in the Vietnam conflict. We'd have easily lost 50 or 60,000 in those conflicts, but we didn't. We lost less because we had better equipment, better training by then on how to deal with irregulars. We had better vehicles by then. better technology by then. So that drastically reduced the death toll on us. But the populations in those nations, oh yeah, lots of fatalities. But what happened was is that they did outlast us. Eventually they outlasted us. You can't fight a forever war. At some point, it has to end. Afghan was 20 years before we finally pulled all the way out of there. 20 years. Iraq, well, you know, we it was from 03 to 2011 officially, but we still really never fully left there. But that ended up becoming somewhat of a forever war in its own right. But as far as the actual fighting going on in Iraq, we were largely done with all that. But it took years. We did not truly have a victory in either of those instances. Why? Because China moved right into Afghan, and so did Russia, right after we left, in the form of the Belt and Road and other schemes. You also had Iraq falling under Iranian influence, largely. So the whole scheme to overturn 7 nations in 5 years failed. But that's also part of prophecy. These nations becoming part of the Eurasian Eastern Bloc, which will morph into a new UN 2.0. The West will be occupied after World War III. We will be occupied by China and Russia and all their little Eurasian allies, and the couple allies they have from the Americas, of course. Africa is largely under Chinese and Russian control. The nation of Mali that we once sent troops to fight ISIS, well, Mali is now under the Russian sphere because they don't see the Russians like they did the French, as a colonial power, but they're largely under the Russian sphere, as is the Central African Republic, where the Russians have been training their troops and have a lot of contacts with their regime. And then you have China with their Belt and Road holding a lot of sway over many nations there, including even South Africa, but also Angola and Ethiopia. Oh, and the Russians are considering building a naval base in Sudan if they have not already gotten that underway. And then, you have all sorts of different multinational bases in Djibouti because they just rent their land out for basing. That's a large part of their GDP and national income in Djibouti. China has a base that's literally 1 mile from our base there. 1 mile. So you have these Chinese vassal states, and also you have nations that are cooperating with Russia. Many nations, what they'll never tell you, took the Russian side in this whole debacle that's going on right now in Eastern Europe. Many nations did. Now, why would that be, you might ask? Well, because when they found out all the facts about it, facts have no bias. Facts have no bias. It doesn't mean that Russia's any less evil. It just means that in this particular situation, the facts had favored them by and large because Ukraine was trained by NATO and they were about to launch an offensive into the Donbass. That's what people don't ever tell you. Russia conducted their operation to shield and protect the LPR and DPR. That's just the fact. It's just the facts of it. Doesn't mean that I like Russia. It's just what happened. It's the facts. But Russia's not any less evil. It just means that the facts actually support that. So, in turn, that's made it a black hole for us, for the West. And we are finding it exceedingly hard on our nations of the West to continually pour money and military assets into that nation. We've already lost a lot of these things that we left behind in Afghan, and now it's gotten to a point with this new black hole where it's even worse than even that was. It's worse. It's worse. Giving away 1/3 of all your rocket artillery ammo, yeah, I'd say that's pretty much a lot worse. It's not even just that, it's also artillery shells and more. There's more. Even some platforms we just gave them. I mean, a lot of the nations in NATO gave away weapons to them. Germany said it can't even afford to give away any more vehicles. So that says a lot. But Germany already pissed away a lot of their military power. Germany was very powerful at reunification in 1990. When the DDR or GDR, if you're English, and the Bundesrepublik or the Federal Republic of Germany unified, the militaries of both former nations reunified into a large fighting force. I mean, relative to the size of Germany, yeah, it was pretty big. Close to 1 million when you put together the armies of both sides, the whole militaries really, and also their reserves and everything. You put them together, they were really close to about 1 million in strength. Now, after all the downsizing over the years, if you look at Germany and how small they are now, reserves and all, 120,000? Man, you all are in trouble. You all are in big trouble. Giving away all your heavy armor over the years, your tanks, be they the old East German tanks, be they the superb Leopard 2, A7s, A6s, A4s, 5s, be it giving all that away, and you're downsizing with it, you're in deep trouble now. You would never, ever be able to stand up to Russia. You probably couldn't even stand up to Belarus in the situation that you're in now. You're in deep trouble, Western Europe. You're in deep trouble. And when the United States comes to its end through collapse, through internal conflict, you ain't going to have nobody to back you up when the Chinese and Russians come in there to collect. That doesn't just mean collect in financial or economic or any of those terms. It means to collect in terms of revisiting upon you the types of things that you did to them, EU, Western Europe, NATO. Yeah, they're going to come in there and collect for the sanctions, for all the things that you've done. Best believe it. Best believe it. You know, that's real. That's real. And East and West are two very different sets of elites, and they have two very different goals. Goals are even very different. So the West tried to subvert the Eastern elites by, trying to go in there with their color revolutions, but the East has likewise done similar. China has carried out assassinations. We know this because we know the guy that eliminated Shinzo Abe, the Japanese former prime minister. I think he was allegedly supposed to run again. Now I don't know if that would have led to anything. I don't know if the bankster elites of Japan would have allowed him back in. I don't know. But we know that guy was connected to the CCP. The Chinese media bragged about it. They bragged about it. We also know that China has been purchasing properties and basing their troops here, who live among us and wear civilian clothes every day and have different job titles. They've bribed our political parasites, or they extorted and coerced them by their MSS, their intelligence agency, catching them in some very creepy, compromising positions. And they had no choice but to obey the CCP. or they took bribes and were glad to sell us out because of greed. Because of greed. So that was how the CCP usurped the Western elites, because the Western elites control these puppets. We already know that through their central banks. But China controls their own central bank, their own issuance of money, as does Russia. In fact, Russia has a bank law whereby their central bank must give half of all its profits to the Russian regime. Half of all profits go to the Russian regime. Now that's control over your central bank. While in the West, our central banks control our regimes. So you have that as a very different thing. Even in India, they put their once private central bank back under regime control soon after they got independence, the Reserve Bank of India. They did allow it a little bit of autonomy, but Modi has been clamping down on that lately. And also Modi has rebuffed appeals from the West to go against Russia because they have a long history. If you paid attention to my video about the old Indian and China, or Indo-Russian relations that I mentioned in that condensed history lesson, that is the basis by which Modi told woke Lloyd Austin, or Lloyd Woke Austin, they told him to kick rocks. Kick rocks. You know, we're not turning on our oldest, biggest ally that we've had. So, you have a lot of different alignments going on. A lot of different alignments. You have the Eurasian bloc, these BRICS, all the nations that are signatories to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of it. A lot of these are things that are run by China. These initiatives, these alliances, but also Russia. As I've said before, not to denigrate them, but they seem sort of like the junior partner in the alliance, sort of like how in World War II, it was Germany and Italy, but Italy ended up becoming like the junior to Germany. When at first it looked like Hitler was like trying to idolize Mussolini. But, you know, you got that sort of a situation developing. And China and Russia, the first and second most powerful nation on earth, are going to be unbeatable in war. There, too, definitely two of the 10 kings, as mentioned in the book of Revelation, who give their power to the beast and reign with him for 1 hour. These 10 Eastern kings who prevail in World War III. There's no West mentioned beyond it being destroyed. So we know they're not Western kings. None of them are. They're Eastern kings from the Eurasian bloc. You know, one of them might be Brazil because they've signed on to BRICS. It's all evil, folks. It doesn't matter if it's the Western Economic Forum or the BRICS. It doesn't matter. They're all evil. They're all evil. But I can assure you, the Chinese who worship their state and Xi Jinping, their emperor for life, their mini little G god, they couldn't give a damn about the WEF or what it wants, because it sure ain't doing none of what the WEF wants. All the stuff that happens in the West, you sure don't see that in China and Russia. The West wants to rip Russia apart. They do. They do. They've said it, and their actions show it. They want to weaken Russia, at the very least, back to how it was in the 90s, where it's controllable, or they just want to rip it all the way apart into different nations that'll be under Western elite control. But the East has its own elites, and they're not standing for that. They have their own plans. It's very much an East-West battle. It's real. It's real, and the actions and the words of both groups shows this is real beyond a shadow of a doubt. So what's really going to happen is the West is going to be ripped apart and dismantled. And its elites are going to be humbled and become slaves. They will be Xi Jinping's footstool. They'll end up in Chinese laogais or Russian gulags. Same thing. So, a lot to ponder. A lot of things to think about. They're very different and want very different things. There will be a UN 2.0. See, the Western mind can't fathom a world that the Western elites don't control, but it's going to happen that way. It's going to happen that way. These Eastern elites are going to prevail. They're going to establish their UN 2.0. It'll come out of the BRICS, the Eurasian bloc. That'll be the new UN, reconstituted, because the West will be occupied, and its elites will be defeated, and its rulers, everything. They're not getting away with nothing. They'll have no power. They can't pay their way out. The Russians and Chinese can just take all their stuff and make them slaves. They have no say in anything. Putin spied on the WEF. When he found out what their intentions were, obviously Russia isn't mimicking anything that the West is doing as far as their domestic policies or anything else. He's a KGB man by trade. He's a spy. So while he pretended to be okay with those people, he was spying on them. Spying on them. Hell, that's what I would do if I was in his position. I would do the same thing. Same with China, and we know China has a history of espionage. I mean, it stands to reason that they've played them like a fiddle, like a harp, and their actions show this to be the case. Just so they could take everything from the West, use it to develop themselves, get the upper hand, and then knife them in the back. They played the West like a harp to get everything they wanted back in the 90s. And they've used it to build themselves into the most powerful nation in the history of the world that the world will have ever known by the time Yeshua returns. Yeshua Messiah will come back, and he will end them. But we're stuck with them until the end of time. As unfortunate as that is, and horrifying at the same time. It is horrifying. Talking about the man, Xi Jinping, who puts his name in the Bible in place of Yeshua Messiah, the King of Kings. Now that is evil. The same man who has laogais, slave camps in his nation, who tortures people, all of these awful, horrible things, organ harvesting, all of it. But that's really saying something that God allowed them to become the most powerful nation on earth, just so that they could humble us. So all the evil things that the West is guilty of will be brought forward into the light. That's why God raises up even heathen nations to punish nations that once had the light of Yeshua but turned their back on it. That's why we get it so hard. You can't say that we didn't deserve it, because if you had the truth and you turned your back on the truth, then you get what was coming to you for it, even at the hands of the wicked. That is one of the themes that's all throughout the Bible. All throughout it. Among others, like self-defense, preparedness, not sitting on your ass and expecting God to do everything for you, because God has expectations of you, which is why he put you here in a physical world, so that you could do physical things. Meet him halfway. Like how Noah built the ark and God shut the door. Joseph harvested and stored the grain. God stretched it out. David defended him and his brethren against Goliath by God guiding that stone into Goliath's head. So you can't just sit on your ass and expect God to do everything for you. You have to take initiative. You must do physical things. So where I'm going with this is to say that a lot of plot twists, as I call them, plot twists and turns are going to happen. People are going to see a lot of things change that they weren't even expecting to happen. Plot twists. plot twists. People think, I mean, there's nothing wrong with focusing on the Western elites, but there's other elites, the Eastern elites. People just totally ignore what they're doing, and they really shouldn't, because they're going to be the ones that crush the West in World War III and occupy them. As evil as the WEF is, all they're serving to do is down and eviscerate their own power base with all their suicidal policies. They're destroying their own grids, their own industries, their own everything, militaries included. For what? For what? Because they want depopulation so bad that it's driven them to this level of insanity, to where they've done a controlled demolition. Their plans are essentially just suicidal plans. I mean, you know, it's madness. When you've gotten that evil, where you want to even destroy what you even have, your own stuff, somebody more powerful, more based, and by based I mean people that are more level-headed, people that are more powerful and more based than you, are going to come in and take you over. That's the natural order of things. That's exactly what's going to happen too. Sun Tzu, you know, let your enemy destroy himself. That's exactly what China and Russia's doing right now, because they know it fits into their plans of their elites for their version of an NWO to let the West destroy itself before invading and obliterating this place, smashing it into the dust. And that's exactly what they're going to do. Even if they did it now, in the state that we're in, they would crush us. They would crush our military and occupy this country. The only thing different, bodied men, people in general, that would pose a headache for them to occupy this place. It would be a headache for them to occupy this place. Why do you think that they're going to let a collapse and internal conflict happen first? So that way, all the trained and able-bodied and experienced people, like war veterans and, you know, people that were in the military before, the old military, not the woke military, the old military. So that way, all the trained and experienced people will wipe each other out. That's their hope, is that that'll happen. So then when they do crush our whatever remains of our woke military, they'll just waltz on in and plant their flag. Ordnance, munition, the hell out of this and plant their flag. Without any opposition, or at least any that matters, keeping their own losses extremely low compared to what they might have otherwise been. You know, they would have lost more people on their side in a protracted, long counterinsurgency. Whereas if they just let us descend into a state where we have no more resources, no more, you know, experienced, trained people, because they've all butchered each other over petty issues or over resources, because people fight for resources when there's a lack of resources, whatever it is, they're going to let that happen first. Just like I put in my internal conflict, all the new ideologies and groups cropped up everywhere. Even neutral areas that wanted to sit everything out, that just defended their communities, which is probably the smartest thing a person could do in such a situation. But these factions, they duked it out, not only against the regime, but against each other. It was just a giant slaughter fest in that hypothetical. So, in real life, all the prerequisites to what happened in that are already coming to pass. They're coming true. And I've shown you in past live shows I've done, especially the miscellaneous ones, how that's the case. Shown you specific examples in real life, in our real physical reality that matches what my research led me to. I compiled all that into this hypothetical that I created based upon my research. These things are starting to happen. These things are happening, but it's still bubbling beneath the surface, meaning that when it all begins to truly coalesce into such a thing where you have the ultimate, slugfest between all these groups, it'll resemble something very much similar to what I had put in the hypothetical. So similar, in fact, that, people that have watched that whole thing, it'll put a lot of people in shock and surprise. I'm going to go ahead and say that because all the concepts are there in terms of the concepts of the multifactional thing, how they would rise. The concepts are there. The names might be different of the groups and people that are leaders or whatever else, but the concepts are all there. Different ideologies, the way they would engage in battle, the high intensity aspects versus most of the low intensity stuff, how it would look. All of it is there. All the concepts are there. Even in the battles, I put so much detail in those hypothetical battles. So much detail. If people would just watch and see, right on down to how logistics affected everything. Everything. I was going to say this too. In my personal opinion, and of course aspects of this are true too, but in my personal opinion, the fact that we are almost out of fuel, not just from the strategic reserve, but just the diesel fuel, just in general, we're almost out of fuel and food. We're living off of stocks, old stocks of food right now, what you see in stores. We're almost out of food. That happened in my internal conflict documentary series. You had certain regions that would go into famines, regions that were close to the front lines where the fighting was. You would have famines in certain areas. Supply chain was totally broken. Everything came to a standstill. There was so little fuel left for the trains, so little diesel at these train yards and in the locomotives, that only in the very beginning of the conflict could trains be used for mobilizing forces, for moving heavy equipment and nukes and things like they did at the huge battle that was between the Mormon State faction and the NSRF faction. Only at the beginning, and toward the middle of it, I should say, that was when the rails could be used. After that, not so much. Not so much. The fuel situation had become to where it was depleted to the point where it affected the logistics. So much so that the different armies began to rely on animal transport. One faction that relied on animal transport from the outset was the Mormon State, because they relied on their coal-burning plants for power. And because they had to rely on animal transport to transport the coal from the coal mines in northern Utah to the power plants, it would get there extremely slowly and in amounts that were much smaller than what they had before. So what they had to do was ration power, like what I saw firsthand in Iraq when I was in Iraq, where a village would be lit up at night for a few hours, and then another one would be lit up, and that one that was lit up would go out like a light switch. They had to ration power because their grid couldn't support there being power all over at the same time ubiquitously. They had to rotate it. Folks, that could only be a result of diminished resources needed to power the plants. Or destroyed parts of the grid itself that required extensive repairs. Can also be a combo of both of those things. But in the Battle of Vegas, they took great care not to damage the power lines because they needed the Hoover Dam to power electricity in different areas that they were fighting over, because that dam can produce a generous amount of power. You know, the regime wanted to control it so that they could send the power back to their loyalist areas in California, their woke, globalist, loyalist areas, and that they could start recapturing the area put it under the Constitution, because that was their whole objective, was to put the whole country back under the Constitution. But not everybody wanted to go along with it, because a lot of people felt that there were irreconcilable differences at that point, so they wanted to do their own thing. We had the Mormon state who wanted it because they wanted to put the whole country under Mormonism, their own extreme brand of Mormonism. So you had all that going on where they were fighting over the resources, even the power generating resources, including dams and other power plants. They fought over WMDs. They wanted to control the nukes. They wanted to control the chemical weapons, like the chemical shells, like the dangerous VX and sarin weapons that are in those depots. And you had all of that going on. Now, because of the lack of resources and fighting over resources, it diminished them even quicker, and to the point to where basically, the country was devastated beyond repair by that point, and we got invaded. In that scenario, the war went on for another several weeks, even after there were no more major campaigns. I made sure to mention that the low-intensity aspects of it continued for several more weeks until our foreign enemies deemed us ready to be invaded, because we would then have no way to even be able to lift a finger against their invasion, because we would be so weak by that point. What really could anybody do? If you don't have food, you don't have plenty of clean water, drinking water, you don't have plenty of rounds, ammo, you don't have the way to produce anything, you don't have anything at all, nothing, no fuel, no nothing. You're done for. You're done for. We would even be done for now, even without a collapse. We would be defeated militarily. The only reason, again, is because they don't want to have to fight a counterinsurgency campaign. They want us to go ahead and just wipe each other out so that they don't even have to worry about it. So all the best people will be out of the way for when they come in. They want it so easy that their occupation will run flawlessly, and that they'll be able to quickly transition this place into New China. New China. And of course, the Arctic areas for Russia, because Russia wants all those resources. Do you understand, if they had all the resources of the Arctic and they turned that whole Arctic Ocean into their Russian lake, how many resources they would have and be in control over? There's an immense amount of hydrocarbons and minerals, just metals, everything up there. Even timber, because you have the taiga forests, all the timber. You know, there's a lot of resources in the Arctic, and to control those, you would be extremely wealthy, because the rest of the world would be buying things from you that you created from the management of those resources and the production of those resources, the mining, the lumbering, all of it, the extraction of the fuels, all of it. You would become extremely wealthy controlling all the resources of the Arctic. So China, they want to feed all their hungry mouths, plus have the resources of the lower 48 to boot, but they really want to feed their people. They would become totally food independent by controlling the lower 48. The Chinese already feel in a large way that they're superior to everybody else in the world. They have that general mentality in the CCP that the Chinese people are superior to all the other peoples of the world. There's a certain arrogance that comes out of their speeches and the way that they view things. It's undeniable. They do very much remind me of the modern day Nazis, because the PAP is a fanatical paramilitary element, much like the SS, but this time for the CCP, which is what the PAP is. And of course, the way their Politburo speaks and regards Western nations is really dismissive, if you've ever really listened to how they speak. They could care less about the West, and they're going to bring it to heel when they take over. And they're going to humiliate its leaders and elites, who by that point will have no power or bargaining chips left on the table, because their militaries will be diminished, their security forces, their wealth, everything. It'll be diminished. Their whole power base will be gone. They'll have no say in anything that happens in the world, because they wouldn't be able to enforce anything. They've already lost control, and their power will only continue to wane, diminish. The internal conflict documentary highlights the fact that that's really the beginning of it. They'll be no more different than Bashar al-Assad in Syria when he was about to lose his civil conflict and be overthrown by the different factions. They'll be no different, really. Only difference is that they don't have any powerful allies by which to call upon to shut it all down. No, instead it'll all be shut down finally when we are invaded. The book of Jeremiah says as much. Dmitry Duduman has said as much. It'll start with an internal conflict, and it'll end with us being invaded and occupied, becoming colonies of foreign nations from the east, China and Russia. So I'm going to greet everybody that's in here. I'm feeling sort of like I was a windbag. I just kept talking and talking. Let's see who's in here before I get going here. Welcome, everybody. This was a long one. Well, no. An hour and 30 minutes. Not too bad. I thought it was almost like 2 hours by now. Let's see who's in here. I got to push buttons. Give me a second. Hey, Lady M. I hadn't seen you in a minute. How you doing? I hope all right. Upside Down Nowhere Man. Good to see you. Michael Sutton. Michael Larson. Juan. Hey, Juan. Yeah, Australian Navy, the whole Australian military is a joke. Their country is so small in terms of population. Their military is puny. They'd get crushed. All China would need was like one group army. One group army could defeat Australia. Most of their people aren't really armed or well trained, so it's like they wouldn't stand a chance. There's only 20-something million, 25 million people in all of Australia? I mean, it's a big landmass, but there's not a lot of people, and most of the people are all concentrated by the seas. They'd get annihilated by China. Hey, Steve James, RJL Harris. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm glad everybody made it. I'm going to get going for the day. Thank you all for showing up, and y'all have oh, hey, Em, how are you doing? Y'all have a blessed day.